suggest that all of you submit your quantum. It's free, open access, it's community run. It's also selective, which means that hopefully, if we all submit our good papers to quantum, we can still use it to, to get our grants and jobs, as unfortunately we are still bound to until maybe one day when that whole model can be turned around. But let's try to give some incentive for quantum to keep going and change the way we do scientific publishing. Okay, so this work, I would like first to first thank the organizers for the opportunity and the Foundational Questions Institute for funding on that. I will start with, as a motivation, a little bit of a story. I'll try to convince you that we have made great success in understanding Bell's theorem in the past few years in particular. That we are close to being able to say that at least half of the puzzle of Bell's theorem, we are close to being able to say that we have understood it. We conquered that problem. I won't talk so much about the other half, but at least the first half, I think we can say that we understand it now. So there's a motivation to say that what about contextuality? That understanding that we are getting now for Bell's theorem, which comes from our understanding of causality, doesn't seem to carry over to contextuality at all. But Bell's theorem is often said to be just a special case of contextuality, so how come that this new understanding about the conceptual basis of Bell's theorem doesn't help us in contextuality? And so the point of this talk will be to provide one direction in which we can do for contextuality what we have done for Bell's theorem. And the title gives you a hint of what that is. But I'll start with this story. So I always like to start my talks by citing famous scientists because that gives some authority to what I'm saying. Don't take my word for it, take Bell's word. So he said, for me then, this is the real problem with quantum theory, the apparently essential conflict between any sharp formulation and fundamental relativity. It may be that a real synthesis of quantum and relativity theories requires not just technical developments, but radical conceptual renewal. And I take here the point of view that this radical conceptual renewal is really about our notions of causality. And I'm sure most of you in this conference will agree it's a conference about causality. I don't need to convince you of that. But I just want you to put this story together and how I see that going. So, okay, that's obviously not a new story. That's, in fact, the whole point of discussions around Bell's theorem for the last 50 years. But the problem is that for most of this time, there hasn't been a lot of progress in that. In fact, one of the most popular ideas is to say that the causal concept that's relevant in relativity is no signaling. And that's the end of the story. But Bell was never happy with that. So he said, well, do we then have to fall back on non-signaling faster than light as this expression of fundamental causal structure? This is hard for me to accept. For one thing, we have lost the idea that correlations can be explained, or at least this idea awaits reformulation. Okay? So it's not just about having some causal concepts, it's about being able to give a causal explanation for things. And for Bell, no signaling doesn't do that for you. And it's fair enough. In fact, what we even mean by a causal explanation hasn't been always entirely clear. Around the time of Bell, Bell's intuition is roughly parallel to this principle of common cause from Reichenbach. This book was in 1956, slightly before Bell, although Bell, I believe, didn't know about it. But that doesn't give you a full sort of theory around what causal explanation means. That has been developed over the years by different authors, and in this particular field, you'll probably all know the work of Pearl. This was published in 2000, which gives you a more comprehensive account of what it means to have a causal explanation, right? Okay, so then this is the kind of thing that Bell was talking about. We need something like the Book of Pearl to be able to talk about causal explanations, not just enough to say, no signaling faster than light. And so from that point of view, then, we really have a problem, because that book, as you know, is just not compatible with quantum mechanics. All right. So then, what is that book? So just review it here. I'm sure most of you know that, but just for those of you who are not familiar. So what does the framework of Pearl say about causation? We represent causal structure as a directed acyclic graph. So it's a graph where there's some nodes representing your random variables of interest, arrows representing your causal links, and we can use this genealogical terminology to talk about sets of variables relative to a given node. So the parents, ancestors, descendants, and non-descendants, they have their obvious meaning. And the whole point of this diagram, of this graph, is to represent the consequences of the causal structure to the probability distributions. For example, in this graph here, we would expect that this node y, this variable y, would screen off x from z. That is, knowing y makes x irrelevant about any predictors for z, and in other words, the probability for z given y and x is just the probability of z given y. Okay. And we can represent those conditional independencies. The notation we use is just that this little thing here. So this is, we read that as being x independent of y given z. And it's meant to satisfy a number of axioms that are these semi-graphoid axioms from a generating set of such conditional independencies. You can generate all the conditional independencies in a graph with these. Okay. Now, the main important principle from this framework is the causal Markov condition, which tells you which variables are independent of other variables and how the graph encodes that. So it says that a variable is independent of its known effects given its direct cause. It's a very intuitive principle. And in this genealogical language, that can be translated as a variable is independent of its known effects given its parents, non-descendants given its parents. This would imply these assumptions, we can derive a local hidden variable model and Bell inequalities. Okay. So that's the what Bell would have called, a causal explanation would be something that follows this framework. So a good causal explanation, at least in the classical sense, wouldn't necessarily lead to Bell inequalities, and then we have a problem. Now, what can we do with that? So before one of the solutions, one of the proposals, you just give up Reichenbach's principle, or here what I call causal completeness, or in other words, just essentially give up the whole theory of causality. But that's too strong, because then we are not left with any notion of causality that is obviously useful in a large number of fields. Another proposal, so this was what I did with Ray Lau recently, was that we can actually break down this principle of common cause into two independent ones. One which just says that there exist common causes that explain the correlations. When two variables are correlated, there must be some common cause that explain that. And the other one is that the correlation must factorize the variables. But this is just one particular way in which you can have an explanation of correlations. You could maintain that principle and just drop that one. So that would be one way. Dropping everything that's in black here would be one way of resolving Bell's theorem. And a number of recent proposals do just that, or at least go good steps into doing that, which is providing a quantum theory of causal networks. So a number of these, or at least a couple of authors in these papers are in the audience here. And so here they provide generalizations of causal networks to the quantum case, which reduce to the classical case in the appropriate limit. So my claim here is that this is a really important step. Bell's, one of the main problems for Bell was that just saying no signaling faster than line doesn't give you a causal explanation. And here we are saying, well, here is how we can give a causal explanation. Now, what would Bell say to that? Maybe, at least for that part of his complaint, maybe he'll say, well, yeah. So is the puzzle resolved? So I would say, at the very least, that this is very important steps towards solving the conceptual puzzles of Bell's theorem. It's really important developments, probably some of the most important developments in understanding the conceptual basis of Bell's theorem since the last 50 years, maybe. I really think that's very important. So, but is that all? Now, as I said, that was the first proposal. I think there's another part which is important to keep in mind. That won't be really the main point of this talk. But the other part on the end of that quote was that, more importantly, the no signaling notion rests on concepts which are desperately vague. The assertion that we can not signal fast and light immediately provokes the question, who do we think we are? And Bell, of course, was talking about the measurement problem, the fact that he not only wanted a causal explanation, but he was also a realist, above all. He wanted an explanation which didn't take, at the fundamental level, notions like measurements, observables, controllables, and controllables, and so on and so forth. And all of these quantum causal models are intrinsically operational in that sense. So they give you a causal explanation, but one that seems to be fundamentally operational. And I think for an operationalist, of course, we can just ignore that as a known problem. But most people ignored Bell's theorem for the first 20 years of its life. I would say we probably should pay attention to the other part of what Bell was saying, and there's probably something else to learn from that. One possibility, which I think is worth thinking about, is that that implies that causality is really an emergent phenomenon. Bell was thinking of causality as being sort of the fundamental building blocks of nature, of objective reality, but really what that might be pointing to is that really it's just an emergent phenomenon, and we might learn from trying to understand how that comes about. And of course, another part of the problem there is that what about indefinite causal structures? We cannot even represent that as a DAG. So these quantum causal models don't tell you the full story if those are feasible. Okay. So that was the just the motivation to then ask the question: what about contextuality? After all, we can think of Bell locality as just a special case of contextuality. So, but obviously in contextuality scenarios, one cannot assume anything about the causal structure. We can be making measurements on a single system. There's nothing about assuming that your measurements are space-like separated and that you must reduce to a particular kind of graph. So this understanding of the conceptual basis of Bell's theorem doesn't seem to carry over to understanding contextuality in any way. So here's a different approach that I'm suggesting to show that all possible causal structures that allow for contextuality have some undesirable property in the classical theory, which is fine-tuning. Okay? So just to get to that, let's just review what another property of classical causal networks that's important for that, which is called deseparation, which is about when a variable screens off other variables in your graph. So we say that x and y are deseparated given z if it blocks all paths from x to y, whereas if it has a chain or a fork, whereas if z is part of an intermediate cause, or if it's a common cause of x and y, then conditioning on z makes x and y independent. But if it contains a fork, whereas if z is part of a common effect of x and y, conditioning on z may actually make x and y dependent. So it blocks x and y if it's in a chain, but it must not be in a fork, or be a descendant of a fork. And we call, we know, but the notation for that is x and y is deseparated from z. That's the notation for this concept. Okay, and two important things about this deseparation. One is that it's sound for all probability distributions that are compatible with a given graph. If the graph has deseparation between x and y given z, then all conditional distributions, all probability distributions which are compatible with the graph have that conditional independence. And it's complete that if for all probability distributions that are compatible with a graph, they have a certain conditional independence, then the graph must have the associated deseparation. Okay. Now, you must be familiar with this work from Wood and Speckens, which has brought this framework of Pearl, probably one of the first works to bring this framework of Pearl to the attention of most of us in this community, where they show that no classical causal model can explain Bell correlations without fine-tuning. I will say in a second what fine-tuning, so this was this paper by Wood and Speckens. And no fine-tuning just means that whenever you have a conditional independence in your graph, we are looking for explanations in which that conditional independence is reflected as a deseparation in the graph. It's reflected as a property of the graph itself, and not just as properties of the causal parameters. The causal parameters being the probability distributions of the inputs in the graph, and the conditional distributions which are associated with the causal links. So we want, whenever there is a conditional independence, we want that to be a property of the graph itself, and not a property of the parameters that we add onto the graph to create our causal model. Otherwise, we have fine-tuning. Okay. Now, so the result here is that we also need fine-tuning for contextuality. So the first step is how do we even talk about contextuality in this sense? So let's just start with, we have 4 variables, just like in a Bell case. We have some x and y's, which we are interpreting as being your choices of settings, and some a and b, which are interpreting as being the outcomes. X and y are chosen from some set of measurements m. At this stage, I'm not assuming anything about the causal structure. I'm not assuming anything that x is done before or after y. I'm not assuming anything about whether or not it's in the same system or a different system. These are just some variables that we are observing, and we are getting some probability distributions on it. And the whole point now is to try to find out something about the causal structure that must be underlying this graph. Right? So that's the point of causal discovery. So we have some set of measurements m, and the contexts are defined as the pairs of x's and y's which are compatible. Okay. Now, in Cauchy-Beckett, non-contextuality is equivalent to factorizability. For each x and y which are part of a context, we have the probability distributions for the outcomes a, b, given x, y, factorized just like in the Bell case. So that's equivalent to Cauchy-Beckett non-contextuality. So two examples of graphs which lead to that are just the usual Bell graph, or say another graph like this, which has just no common causes at all. So of course they will factorize, and a number of different other graphs will lead to the same conclusion. So the goal will be to show that either we have graphs of this form which lead to non-contextuality, or we have graphs which require some sort of fine-tuning to explain the correlations. So what do we need, of course, to make some extra assumptions for that. So first, we consider quantum correlations which have these 3 properties here. The first is that you have no signaling between the 2 measurements there. The A is independent of the setting y given x, and B is independent of the setting x given y. That, of course, is guaranteed by the fact that we take x and y to be compatible. And we also assume that the outcomes of a particular measurement depend on the inputs. That, of course, rules out cases in which you have unbiased outcomes, but that's the class of correlations that we're restricting ourselves to. The same assumption had to be done in the paper from Wood and Speckens as well. I don't think you can do anything unless you make that assumption. Okay, and the final assumption is that we have a violation of a Cauchy-Beckett contextuality inequality. Now, if we assume no fine-tuning, then from the first one, from assuming that we have these 2 conditional independencies here, we must have the corresponding d-separation in the graph. If we didn't have that, we would have to have some sort of fine-tuning to arrive at those conditional independence, because the separation is complete. And from the second one, from the second that these independencies, these dependencies exist in your statistics, we have that we cannot have the corresponding d-separation in the graph. Otherwise, we would require fine-tuning to get that. Okay. Now, so the result is then that all causal models which are compatible with these 2 assumptions violate no fine-tuning. And you prove that by exhaustion. I'm not going to prove all of it here, but I'll give just a taste of a couple of cases of that. Let me get some. Oops. So let's say you have A, B, X, Y. So let's consider the first independence condition there. So A, independence of Y given X. So that implies that A is d-separated from Y given X. So for example, then, that would rule out this node here, this edge here. It would rule out a direct connection between B and X. Both of those would mean that, sorry, I'm talking about A and Y. So let me just do the other one. So this would rule out these two connections here. It would also rule out there being a common cause between A and Y, because that would mean that A and Y are not separated from X. We would rule out this case. We can just represent this whole thing here as this. So all of that is ruled out. From the other assumption about B independent of X given Y, you see that you can also rule out this one. And likewise, you can rule out common causes which act on any three of the variables, because they would have to act between two of these. So we could say rule out all these things here, and so on and so forth. So going through this, you see that all of the graphs which do not require fine-tuning, what you are left with are graphs which lead to with respect to non-contextuality inequality. Now you may think like, well, but obviously there is a causal structure in that case. Say, for example, I go to the lab and what I'm actually doing is I'm measuring X before A, X before Y. So let's say I think obviously this is the causal structure on a particular experiment that I'm doing X. And then depending on X, I choose Y. And of course, there must be a dependence between X and Y because they must be compatible. So first I go and choose X out of my set of measurements. And then I go and choose Y out of the set of measurements which are compatible with X. So clearly there must be an error here. And then by assumption, there must be some errors here because these guys are dependent. Obviously, I started with some quantum state. I'll just call this lambda here, but I could call it rho. And presumably that influences the first measurement there. And now it would be natural to think, well, then now there's an error going from here to here. And what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that it violates no fine-tuning. Because now there's a path between X and B, which is not screened off by Y. And then you can say, well, so what? What's the problem with that? I think that the issue here is the following. First of all, what made us rule out that same situation in the Bell case? Was it just the space-like separation? We rule out that in the Bell case because of, that was just in the Wooden-Speckens proof. There was only the fine-tuning itself. It was nothing about space-like separation. We didn't assume it was space-like separation. It could be that we were talking about a Bell scenario in which one measurement actually occurs after the other. But if you make a conclusion that that is not a good explanation when they are space-like separated, why does it suddenly become a good explanation when they are time-like separated? Does just making them time-like separated and suddenly make that causal connection come out of nowhere? No. So presumably it's not a good explanation there either. And then you can think of this, well, what is this measurement doing here? It really is just entangling your system with some ancilla here. And then you can just give a finite representation of what that measurement is doing. It's doing an entanglement between your system and an ancilla. And then your system goes away to B, and then you measure your ancilla. But now you can just spread those guys apart, and now you have a Bell scenario. So by small deviations from the Bell scenario to this scenario, where in this point would this suddenly become a good causal explanation? It's not clear. And I think the argument here is that it doesn't. Because this would violate no fine-tuning. That's one way of thinking of that. But at least I'm trying to give an argument that just naively thinking that this gives you the causal explanation for this case may have problems. Okay. But in any case, I guess we can discuss that. Well, one important thing is here is that at least we can give formally similar justification for derivation of Bell inequalities as contextuality inequalities from causal structure. And how about Specken's contextuality? Here I was talking about Cauchy-Specker non-contextuality. Now, many of you may prefer Specken's notion of contextuality. Now, I'll just mention without proof either that you can understand that as a special case of no fine-tuning as well. So no fine-tuning could underlie both of these kinds of both of these notions of non-contextuality. Because in an ontological, Specken's notions are specifying the context of an ontological model, and ontological models implicitly assume a causal structure. In that form, you have some preparations, transformations, and measurements, and some systems in between. And if you apply now no fine-tuning to that causal structure, you get Specken's notion of preparation, transformation, and measurement from contextuality. So the point here is that thinking about no fine-tuning can give a sort of a causal underpinning to non-contextuality and unify that and build locality. Now, two important points to make. There's no assumption of determinism that is needed here. There is an assumption about the correlations that we observe. It is theory independent. There's no assumption about quantum mechanics, as opposed to many derivations of contextuality, which assume they have projectors and so on. So it's theory independent in that sense. And of course, it leads to a lot of interesting questions. For example, what about contextuality for arbitrary quantum networks? Can we relax these requirements that we have those independence conditions, but we have that sort of almost independence conditions, and still have some sort of generalized notion of no fine-tuning that relates to the strengths of the causal connection? And what about quantum causal models? Can they now explain the quantum correlations without fine-tuning? I think that would be the analogous solution for contextuality from what we have for Bell's theorem from the causal models. Thank you.